All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's NAEA Museum Education Peer-to-Peer Hangout. Thanks for joining us. For those of you tuning in for the first time today, we are very glad to have you in the conversation. The Museum Education of NAEA hosts these monthly hangouts on the second Wednesday of each month at this time, and we address different topics relating to the field of museum education with regards to research and audiences, programming, and much more, and so we hope you continue to tune in. I want to remind everyone, whether you're coming for the first time or you've been to many hangouts, that these hangouts are meant to be interactive. So we encourage you to use the Q&A feature with Hangout. So if you scroll over, you can find that Q&A feature by hovering on your screen, and there's an icon on the left-hand side that says Q&A. So you'll be able to ask questions of our panelists, add comments to what you're hearing, and additionally, if someone else poses a question or comment that you are really jazzed about or want to hear being addressed, you can press the +1 button and vote for that comment, and we'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the session. So I think that's all of our housekeeping. So let's go ahead and get started. We are really excited to jump into today's hangout on diversity. My name is Melissa Tanner, and I'm going to be facilitating our conversation today. I'm the Family Programs Educator at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in planning for today's hangout, we quickly realized the complexities involved with such a huge and important topic and a really general headline of diversity. So to be honest, that felt really overwhelming. And I will admit that, as I admitted to the panelists as we were talking leading up to today, that I was really, really hesitant to facilitate this conversation. I felt I wasn't a specialist in issues of diversity and sensitive to my own viewpoints and positionality, but that's why conversations like today's are so important. We can't shy away from these issues and their complexities, no matter how sensitive we feel. And there are many institutions and individuals that are addressing issues of inclusion and access, diversity, participation, and we need to share our successes as well as our uncertainties, our missteps, our challenges, and that's what this conversation is really going to be about. So our panelists, as well as some individuals that were unable to work with us today, have worked together to compile some resources, and so after today's hangout session, we'll be able to share those resources on our event page, and that can really continue the conversation. It can be a living resource that you all as participants can add to, can live with, can work with, can learn with, and hopefully we can continue supporting one another. So in speaking with many museum educators and community facilitators, cultural organizers, a few recurring themes kept bubbling up to the surface, and so that's what's going to shape our conversation today. We're going to be thinking about issues of language, holding difficult conversations with ourselves and with one another, and what this looks like within the context of museum education. So this conversation will certainly not address every issue, and it should be viewed as one of many important dialogues that have already continued, that are going to continue, and so it's one of many that we're going to have together. So I will stop rambling because I am honored by the group that is joining us today, and we have 5 incredible individuals that are representing a diversity of experiences, backgrounds, and viewpoints, and they're going to be sharing their expertise and thoughts today. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to them, and I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves, where they're from, and the work that they do with a shared question. So what I'm going to be addressing our topic of diversity today. We are just getting ready to introduce our panel, so I will, without further ado, get them started on that. As I was just saying, I'm going to just start from left to right, so I'm going to start with Anna and Candra, and I'm going to ask everyone the same question to introduce themselves, just to get the ball rolling with a doozy. And what does a radically diverse and inclusive learning environment look like? And I'll let everyone speak to that point. So Anna and Candra, I'll let you take it away.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Anna Ferguson Hindley, and I work at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is the Smithsonian's newest museum that's not even open yet. So we're looking forward to our opening date coming in September. But this is my thought partner and dear friend. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Candra Flanagan, and I'm here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture with Anna, and I serve as Student and Teacher Programs Coordinator, which gives me a wonderful opportunity to work with Anna, our early childhood specialist here in our education department.
So, I think Candra and I are in a place where we get to think about these things every day and really are committed both professionally and personally. And so for us, the idea of what is radical isn't that radical because it's what we are doing and what we believe in, and that's really thinking about rather than a top-down approach, but really a collaborative, welcoming approach to our visitors and thinking about the different stories that they bring and what we can learn from them, and as well as how we can use history to change and shape the future.
And we're looking for all of our visitors from birth on up to look at themselves and see, while they recognize their differences, like look at it and celebrate their uniqueness. And that's what we are moving and striving towards here through our work.
Awesome. Thank you both. Margaret, I see you next in my lineup here.
Hi, I'm Margaret Middleton. I'm an exhibit designer and developer in Boston, and I was thinking that I was last, so but the one piece of, I think that maybe we'll get to this later.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead. Just for
when we talk about a diverse museum, I think that it's an important thing to think about is that diversity is the fact and inclusion is the choice, and that our museum staffs should reflect the kinds of audiences that we want at the museum.
Awesome. Thank you. I really like that fact and choice. I see next on my lineup I've got Monica. Go ahead and introduce yourself for us.
Hi, I am Monica Montgomery, and I'm the co-founder of Museum Hue. I also am the director of the Latimer Historic House Museum in Flushing, Queens, and I've recently started a mobile social justice museum, the Museum of Impact. So, radically diverse, inclusive environment, wow. I think it's looking at it like a community of practice, seeing ways that you can share, you can grow, you can learn from other colleagues, you can learn from visitors. Any community stakeholders can be included in that vision for the radically diverse. I'm a fan of the term radical. Everyone has a different meaning for it, but I feel like radical is really doing things differently to get better results. It's an iterative process.
Great, thank you. And last and certainly not least, I've got Naomi.
Hey everyone, I'm really happy to be here. My name is Naomi Milstein, and I am the executive director of a nonprofit called the Chicago Freedom School. And we work with young people ages 14 to 19 to support them to grow as leaders and activists for social justice. And then we also work with adult allies and intergenerational groups from schools, other nonprofits, and universities and many other places to do training and capacity building to support social justice-based youth development as well as anti-oppression practices in schools and workplaces. So a lot of the things that we talk about are similar to what others have said, but really that we want to root the learning experience for our young people and for those that come to our workshops really in people's experiences and stories and narratives so that they're really honoring those and having that opportunity to collectively hear from folks' experiences and rooting education in that. We really come from a popular education approach to our works. One way that we think about a radically inclusive and diverse learning environment.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. It's a great start to our conversation, and as we've already acknowledged, holding these conversations with issues of diversity and inclusion and community and practice, this can be really difficult. And first and foremost, we want to ensure that everyone involved, regardless of audience or peer or colleague, feels comfortable speaking their truth and participating in a respectful environment and a respectful conversation. And this is especially true if and when we disagree with one another. So I'm going to turn to Naomi again for just a moment to set the stage and to share with us some of the agreements that the Chicago Freedom School uses with workshop participants. I know I got to attend a workshop and loved it and have used it in some programs of my own, so I would love to share those. And I think, Julian, if you have the screen share, we can show those agreements at the same time.
Great. So, so at the Freedom School, for our workshops, as well as in our youth programming, we always like to start meetings and programs with the group deciding on some group agreements of how they're going to work together and what values and guidelines shape how they want to be together. We generally call them working agreements, and usually when we have time, we have the group come up and create them themselves. But for our time here, some of the ones that are kind of at the core of the work, the core of the agreements are one diva, one mic. So it's kind of like one person talking at a time. And also these are ones that our young people come up with, so a lot of these are some of the things that they've come up with, the way that they like to talk about agreements. So don't yuck my yum. So if a person has an opinion, don't just immediately put it down, but be able to allow space for multiple opinions in the space. Land the plane. We've all been a part of groups where we really just want to talk and we're kind of circling around the point that we want to make. So we like to say land the plane, right? So sort of get to the point so that we can move conversation forward with focus, right? Vegas policy, that's around confidentiality. So being able to say, what we say in the space stays in the space in terms of, especially in terms of who said it. So it's like kind of like sharing learnings, but not sharing who said what necessarily. Take space, make space, and that's referring to a couple of things. So taking space. So if you're a person that's generally quiet in a group, really challenging yourself to take some space and to have your voice be spoken into the room. And making space, which is also like, okay, if you're a person that speaks up a lot, to really sort of maybe take some moments and have allow other folks to have their voices be heard. We used to say step up, step back, and so in being conscious of language, really thought that it's not really about stepping up and back, right? It's about the space that we're creating. So take space and make space. Be present. If folks need to make a phone call or something like that, we just ask that they step out of the room so that they can be really present for the work that we're doing. And I guess the other thing that I want to add, the other agreement that I think is a really good one, especially when we're doing workshops related to identity, power, and oppression, is don't freeze people in time, right? So thinking about that we're all on a journey, and so what I say and believe now may not be the same thing that I believe in 5 minutes, and may not be the same thing that I believe in a year or 5 years. So really allowing that space for folks to learn and be on that journey of reflection and learning and action.
Awesome. Sorry, I pushed the wrong button there. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you for sharing those. I love that language, and especially too thinking about the fact that some of the pieces that you've used are ones that are shared with and created with audience, and especially hearing youth voice in there is a really nice way to start that conversation. So now that we've established some of our shared agreements, it seems important to really start thinking about about language and communication and the words that we're using. And there's many buzzwords that are floating around that we need to impact, both their intended meaning, their implied meaning, and as we've talked about in planning for today, the very title of our hangout, talking about diversity, is a word that can abstract from the real issues that we're trying to talk about. So obviously each cultural organization is unique, and each educator themselves is unique and must find their own way to address institutional use of language. But I'd really like to ask everyone, which words do you see being misused or used in a way that could easily be misinterpreted? And likewise, which words might be more useful for productive conversations that we can have with some of these difficult conversations? So, Monica, can I ask you to start us off on that?
Yes, you can. I had a feeling. I think words that are being misused is the term diversity. It's so bandied about. I feel like it's become almost meaningless in some settings. And a lot of times the word diversity, just by someone saying it, they're like patted on the back like they've done something. You know, it's like, oh, we're trying to increase diversity. And everyone's like, oh, that's great. We support your efforts. And no more is said and no more action steps seem to be taken. So I feel like that word, if it's not misinterpreted, it's used very loosely for a variety of things. And I'd like to see a little more teeth and more action behind that.
Great, thank you. Margaret, I know you've had some a lot of different topics that I've read some pieces of yours. We have some of your writings on our resource page. So can I turn to you to answer some of that same question?
Sure. Well, this was a topic that we talked about. I presented with some Inclusium folks at last year's AAM conference in Atlanta, and that was what we ended up talking about. We had originally been wanting to talk about language, but we went to so many sessions. Our session was at the end of the conference, and we had gone to so many sessions already that we were like, we keep hearing these words. I don't think they mean what we think they mean. And it was so clear to us that words like diversity or words like inclusion or community or outreach or even the word invitation get used as code words, and it abstracts. I mean, I think that community gets used in a really weird way. I think, you know, well, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I think that we in the museum community, we use the word community, we mean Black and brown communities. Like, I think that that's what we're actually talking about. Or, you know, I hear the term LGBT community a lot, and that sort of implies that there's a singular community there of people who are all very like-minded and have the same interests. And that's just not true. So I would love for us to start talking about very specific communities and exactly what we want to do instead of just using the word community very broadly.
Great. So even both examples are talking these blanketed terms, so being really direct and honest and forthright about what exactly we're talking about and who are these groups and what exactly are we addressing. So thank you. Anna and Candra, can I ask you the same question?
Sure. So one of the words that I think pops up within our work often is underserved, and just using that term of underserved. And when it pops up, I believe often a picture pops into people's minds of who are these underserved that you are referring to, but I think it would be more helpful if we would be more specific rather than just using the term underserved, because I think it does two things. It doesn't help us take action and get to where we may actually notice that there is an issue or a need to reach out to another community, but it also paints with a broad brush, I think, the picture of the people that come up when the word underserved is used.
Another thing that comes up in our work a lot is thinking about equality and fighting for equality. We want to get to equality, but really looking at the difference between equality and equity, and we want people actually to go towards equity over equality, because equality is about everyone getting the same thing, but equity is about individual needs, and we need to be looking at the individual needs to be able to serve our different audiences.
And then we had one more word.
We have one more word.
We were thinking also about the term race and just the use of the term race, and then often people say, oh, let's talk about race. It becomes a very binary conversation, and we are moving through in our programming thinking of ways in which we can open the conversation so that it's not just a very black-white conversation, that it can be more inclusive in that way. That's one of those other words that we've been trying to work on unpacking and working with our different constituents to unpack.
Great, thank you. Naomi, can I invite you to address a similar question? I know that even if it's something that's already been said, or any other pieces or words that you notice.
Sure. There were a couple of words. One, similar to underserved, I was actually thinking of the term of at-risk youth. And then another term that has started to pop up, which is supposed to be contrary to that, which is at promise. And so thinking about, like, well, what does it mean when we really say that, and how do we really think about youth in context, but also just similar to, being more specific about the communities of young people that we want to serve, and some of the things that they are facing that are very real, but at the same time being just much more specific about who the young people are that we want to reach. And then the other word that that it comes to mind too is around ally and allyship. And one of the things that we talk about in some of our workshops are that, like, just because you've gone to a workshop or because you've done some reading, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're an ally, and that's something that you can't claim to be, right? That others can maybe refer to you as an ally, but it's not something that you can say, I am an ally because I'm at a certain place. You know what I mean? I think that comes through your actions. I don't know if that made sense, but.
Oh, absolutely. I think it sounds across the board. Our conversation is making connections to specifics and labels that not only that we need to be conscious of labels we're putting on other individuals, but also the labels that how that impacts our conversations and our understandings. And I know we had a conversation with my colleagues here at the Art Institute recently, and kind of made the connection to, this is not a pipe, right? So what is it that we are referring to? How are these words masking? How are they kind of halting and stopping our conversations? And it seems to be a Band-Aid for what ends up being protection about difficult conversations, which is what I want to transition us into, because the language in these individual words are part of a bigger puzzle. And several of you used the word action in your definitions here, and so how can we put the words you just shared or these ideas to action with productive and safe conversations? And I think that those conversations are kind of in two different places. Sometimes that conversation needs to start within and with ourselves, so maybe we can start there. So how do we begin these conversations with ourselves and recognize our own unconscious bias, our own, where we begin, where we are, and honor and respect that, and then also push ourselves a little bit further. How about Naomi? Can I pull you back up to think on that and the way that we begin with ourselves internally?
Sure. Some of the things we talk about a lot in our work at the Freedom School, or that I have thought, I guess I can speak to sort of my positionality as a white woman, right? So reflecting on my own actions and beliefs. So really thinking and reflecting upon how have I acted in oppressive ways, or in what ways has my life and my history been shaped by systems of whiteness and privilege, and how do I check myself the next time in order to be accountable. I think there's lots of resources out there to sort of think about, well, what questions could I ask myself to start to identify those things? and to be able to just do that really conscious reflection. I think there's also a piece around doing our own homework, right? So reading, learning history, not asking people of color to be your teachers or interpreters, right? But being able to find resources to educate yourself. I think about doing a lot of listening as well. And then also in terms of like being accountable, so like acknowledging that outcome carries more weight than, sorry, hang on. Sorry, I was just trying to quiet, our phone was ringing. So thinking about acknowledging that like outcome carries more weight than intent, right? So like if there's, if you are called out for an action or something, like being humble and listening and engaging in conversation, right? And then I guess the other piece that we think too about in terms of challenging unconscious bias is around acting, right? So interrupting microaggressions or interrupting, inequitable practices and policies in both like a firm but also a loving way, right? So in a way that still engages in conversation and doesn't just sort of distance ourselves from it. So those are some of the things that that I think about and that we've talked about in some of the workshops we've done, in particular with white folks and white folks that are and want to do racial justice work.
Great, thank you. I think that is another great reminder of the resources that we want to share with this group and that we want others to share with us and bring back, and that there are many places to be a part of these conversations and to learn and to research on your own and to continue that conversation and to educate yourself in those pieces. And sometimes there's missteps, and there's often missteps. Maybe I should correct myself on that. It's sensitive conversations, and so really arming ourselves to have the most information and be as informed as we can. Monica, can I ask you that same question? So how do we work through and with unconscious bias and begin these conversations and understand them within ourselves?
Sure. I just wanted to harken back to something that was said earlier about the underserved. And it's such an interesting term because I used to be a classroom teacher and then segued into museum administrator and museum education. And when I was teaching in the classroom, we were always talking about Title I, and to get on a field trip and go for free, tell the museum you're Title I and they'll give you anything. And so that's a kind of code word as well for underserved. Also, with my work with Museum of Impact, I recently did a pop-up exhibit over the weekend, and a lot of people came. And it was the case that someone told me, they were like, that was a really great exhibit, but I don't think the underserved came. And I said, what made you say that? And they were like, oh, they didn't look underserved. They look cultured. They look happy. They looked excited to be there. And I'm like, well, what does an underserved person look like? So I think we have to really like challenge our notion of like someone that we think is underserved that might be like weeping in the corner applying for public benefits, when really there's so much nuance to that designation and to the lives and the living that people have in those circumstances. Like, we shouldn't typecast them. So just wanted to throw that out there. In terms of beginning conversations with ourselves, I think recognizing the implicit bias and the cultural insensitivity that sometimes we have, even, personally myself, trying to kind of demystify these things in my mind that I assume. So recently, someone said to me, oh, I want you to speak on a panel with a CEO. And I immediately thought, oh, that person is a male, right? And the person turned out to be a female, and I'm like, oh, like I shouldn't default to that. That's my own implicit bias that I have to overcome to realize there's space, because being a woman director myself, there's space for other women to direct and lead. So I think it's just kind of understanding your thinking, trying not to be exclusionary in your thinking, and just realizing that the unconscious bias is what keeps us stuck. But if we can envision this future, there's room for everyone in all seats of the table.
That's great. And it's important, too, to notice that when those moments come up, they can be really surprising, right? Like, to your point, Monica, you can, wait, I didn't mean to feel that way, or I'm surprised I had that reaction. And to acknowledge that and to work through that is a really powerful and important thing to note, so thank you. On the other side of that, how do we take these conversations then and how do we begin to have them with others? And how do we meet people where they are, especially as educators and facilitators? How do we meet people where they are, recognizing their truths, recognizing that their truths may be different from our own, respecting that space, not pushing people further from where they are. And so just kind of, where do we begin, and how can we help with that? And I know, Anna and Candra, you've mentioned you've done a lot of work in this front, so maybe I can start with you too.
So one of the good things about implicit bias is that it's not fixed, just like our identity is dynamic and ever-changing. Once we begin to recognize the implicit bias that we carry, we can actually change our thinking and redirect it. And so that's the first step, and also a word of encouragement to all of you who might be feeling like, oh my gosh, I have this in my life, and how can I, move away from it? How does it not control my behavior? Because one thing we know about implicit bias is that it does, it can determine behavior. So once you're aware of it, you can begin to redirect it and think in different ways and change your thinking. So.
As part of our programming, what we are doing here with the museum is we are really mindful of creating an open and safe, and as one of our participants termed it, brave space. We work really hard to create that space where people can come in and be vulnerable and speak their truths, knowing, I think oftentimes people are hesitant to speak their truths because they feel that they will be judged. And while we may not agree, we want people to be able to speak their truths, because within that conversation of speaking their truths, we start to find commonality. And I think as facilitators, we are constantly working on ourselves to think about our implicit bias, to think about where our biases lie, to think about how to move our biases and shift them. But then also, I think one of the things that I think that Anna and I practice a lot with each other is just working on that, the being open and non-judgmental as we start to interact with things that perhaps truths that maybe we don't agree with, or truths that are different than our own, that we work to meet those truths in the comments that are said with neutrality, in a way that we can then find that commonality and begin the discussion in order to, I think, then make that change where people can move their implicit biases and then their actions.
Thank you both. Margaret, can we steal your voice in here too?
Absolutely. So I have 3 little exercises that I wanted to share with folks that are ways that I think that have been really helpful to me in facilitating conversations around implicit bias. The first one is talking about socially constructed terms, meaning like, because a lot of this has to do with these kinds of code words. So like unpacking a word, like I've done programs where we unpack the word family, and what we do is the whole group all together will come up with a group definition for the word family, and it's really interesting to see it shift from what may start as a stereotype or a symbol and move towards something that is way more inclusive. So that's one. Another one would be to have everybody in a group take either like index cards or sticky notes and talk about, have on each one maybe like 5 different identities that they have personally. And then ask them to take away all but one and see what it feels like to be kind of pigeonholed by that one singular identity. And that gets at this idea that our identities intersect with one another, and it can be really misleading, and it can feel very alienating to be essentialized by a singular identity. And then the third one that I would recommend doing is practicing using gender-inclusive language. And I think that, we hear a lot about like gender-neutral language, and I think a better way to talk about that would be gender-inclusive language. It makes room for all genders, and I mean that like beyond the binary of man, woman. And that can be as easy as just trying out the singular they. They went to the store today and they bought some milk, that kind of thing. So there's 3.
That's great. Thank you. Those are really helpful too in thinking about knowing the audiences that are, or the educators that are tuning in today, and the different audiences that we work with, that there are levels of these conversations that we can have. So even some of those tips that you just shared, Margaret, are great, thinking of introducing with family audiences and things that we can do with our youths, with our educators, and kind of everyone in between. So it's nice to have some resources, and I think that this is a beginning of many other ways that we can share tips and tricks that we're working with learners of all ages, because this is not a conversation that's just for a certain age group or grade level, but ways that we're practicing and modeling this in many different ways. So thank you. Thank you all. In hearing responses from our panel, and in thinking just in my own career, there's many anecdotes that we could share of both successful and difficult conversations, whether it's with museum audiences or with colleagues or volunteers that might work in our institutions, depending on where we're located and who we're working with. So how we participate in those conversations while honoring our personal ethics and values, as well as our professional role and responsibility, is, I think, another really big question. So in other words, what is the pedagogy of being a representative of your museum? I think of this in the sense of, I'm standing before a group and I'm wearing a badge that has my museum's name on it, and I might have somebody stand before me and say something that is to my core something I disagree with. But how do I speak to and value my ethics while also responding to a voice that I may or may not need to have given my institutional relationship? So I was wondering if we could speak to some of these tips. So tips for dealing with micro and macro aggressions, or tips with dealing with these differentiated opinions while representing your institution. So Anna and Candra, can you guys start that off for us?
Sure. So Candra and I had a side conversation, and we're realizing that we're using a lot of terms that everyone might not understand, including things like implicit and explicit bias, unconscious bias, and then micro versus macro aggression. So we thought it might be helpful just at the beginning, very quickly define some of those terms for anyone who's listening, like Googling quickly, being like, wait, what does that mean? Especially with micro and macro aggression. So the macro aggressions are the obvious words or actions that are in big scale offensive or prejudiced or racist. But the microaggressions are a little harder to pinpoint. Sometimes they happen so quickly that you walk away and suddenly you're like, whoa, what did that mean? But they can be everyday occurrences, and again, it can be with words or actions that undercut a certain group of people or reinforce stereotypes.
And so for some of the tips, I think, and thank you very much, Melissa, for kind of setting that scenario that when you're there standing, with your museum's, name on your name tag, and someone says something that just brings up that fire inside. What are the things that you can do? And from our side, it doesn't have to always be on the museum floor even. Take a breath. And I think that's one of the things that we talk about a lot, is just taking a time to take a breath, stop, and regulate yourself, so that your response can be a very thoughtful response, a very a measured response, because your goal is not to further incense that moment, that situation. You want to help to get that person to understand why that moment may not, why you may be having some disagreement in that moment. And sometimes you might need a moment to walk away. But taking the breath, stopping, doing your best not to get defensive in that moment. I think from a museum perspective, we do often fall back on our mission. We're falling back to look to see what's our mission, what is our main goal of being here, having the museum open, being here on the floor. And it's looking at that mission and going back to say, how can I further this mission in that moment? So taking that breath, stopping, not to be judgmental, taking a moment to say this person has some truths that are different, has some background and some experience that are different than my own. I need to question, wonder where they're coming from, and then go back to that mission and say, how can I move us to getting to that mission of my museum? And that will, I think often for us, that's what we are using to help us in these moments of these microaggressions.
It's not always
it brings up some that come into my mind.
We've had some experience with this.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain everyone is thinking of that moment that they were like, "Ooh, did I breathe enough? Did I get that response?" So it's important to have those conversations. It's important to hear how others may have responded differently, or maybe they didn't find that moment offensive. But it's important to have those conversations to see and to again put yourself in check. And I appreciate you both taking that moment to pull us back and to, much to the point that we had at the beginning of this conversation, what are we talking about? Defining the words that we were using. So I appreciate that.
I picture how each of us have like an invisible line that connects us to each other, and we are all connected to one another. And when one person says something, we might be pulled in one direction or another. And so just being mindful that others have impact on how we feel, and what they say impacts us, but also then reflecting internally and thinking about yourself and how your words have impact on others, and being more mindful of that. Because it can go both ways in the museum world, where sometimes it might be coming from a visitor, or sometimes it might be coming from a museum staff. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that extra point. Margaret, what are some, you've just shared some great tips in terms of conversations and ways to begin some activities and language here. So do you have some other tips that you can share about dealing with some of these aggressions, or dealing with some of these differences that may come up after doing an activity like one of the ones that you shared? What are ways that you can break those conversations down or respond to them in a healthy and safe way?
Well, if you are already in one of these safer spaces having this conversation, it can be a little easier because you can have that in the ground rules that you're setting up at the beginning, like Naomi was talking about earlier. One of those rules that I've used in the past is ouch, then educate. And that's where if anybody is either feels uncomfortable or offended by something that somebody says, they can say ouch, and they have a chance to talk about what was going on for them in that moment. And so that can be really helpful when you're in those safer spaces. If you're on the floor and you've got your name badge on and all of that, one of my go-to questions that I have when I'm encountering something like one of these microaggressions is, can you tell me what you meant by that? And often that is that can be a very gentle way of asking somebody to re-examine what it was that they just said. And they may actually have a chance to recognize some of that implicit bias that they just showed you.
I'm wondering if, and I can open this up to anyone really quickly, just an interjected question, ways that we can respond to in asking visitors or in asking audiences to repeat that a little bit more, or go in a little more depth in terms of what you meant by that comment or question. How can our role standing before a group, or facilitating, educating with a group, learning with a group, how can we step away from what ends up being a referee, or pulling two different ideas that might be opposing in audiences? What are some tips that maybe anyone can speak to that we can move a conversation along productively, or maybe put a stop on a conversation if it seems like it's getting to a point that's a little too heightened? Does anyone have any thoughts or feedback on that? And that's open. I was throwing it out to you all. There was no direct order. Just wanted to see if anyone had some thoughts on that, because I know that often comes up in in working with audiences that are coming from different backgrounds, different places, different truths. So just some ways if anyone has come across or had any ideas for successfully managing those conversations. We can hold on to it. Maybe it's one that we all need to think about a little bit more. Sounds like one that is a challenge and is maybe one we're not quite as ready to hold on to. So maybe we can hold on to that. That sounds fine. I want to do, and we're coming close. I'm seeing too in our Q&A, it looks like people are sharing a lot of great articles. I'm super excited about this. There's some links, some readings, some calls to action that have been shared. So we will update our resource page and make sure that to include those links and keep them coming. This is something that we will continue to work with and on. I know we're coming close on time, and I want to ask another question about museum education, but first we have another Q&A question that I want to address really quickly that's asking, what does speaking your truth mean? And wondering if this is a recent term in the United States. So another moment where we can call back, step back and to acknowledge maybe some language that we've been using, but someone on the panel want to address what that means or what we're referring to when we're saying speaking your truth?
I'll take a stab at it. I think speaking your truth is about being unapologetic in your stance, really holding space for your lived experience as well as your worldview, your perspective, and your outlook. And in museums, it's being courageous enough to counter whatever the dominant narrative is, to include space for other voices and a multiplicity of interpretations. I feel like it's just really being courageous and unapologetic in a general sense.
Great, thank you. Anna and Candra, did you want to add to that, or do you feel good on that?
Monica did great, but just I think it also, so I don't want to take away from Monica, but it also is about knowing that your truth is your perspective and your experiences, and you should not place that onto others as their truth. So I think that's part of it as well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do one more question here that's been showing up on the Q&A. It says, I'm curious how we as museum educators can bring the rest of the staff along. Often diversity ends up being the job of the education department. And how can we encourage the entire museum to take ownership, which I think links to some other aspects that we were hoping to get to. I know our time is coming closely to an end, but this is a really important conversation. I think it's another piece of the, someone was mentioning before, I think Monica, you were saying before, the ways that we say, oh gosh, we didn't have enough underserved audiences, right? Or we didn't reach this group or that group. But I think this is another part that falls into education's hands often, and thinking about roles of reaching diverse groups, right? And so what exactly does this mean, and how can we extend this conversation beyond education? So opening that idea. So how can we encourage the entire museum to take ownership? Anyone have thoughts on that? Be able to answer that? I can't tell. Anna, are you clicking on it, or are you? Yeah. Okay.
Well, it's definitely tricky, and it depends. Each organization has its own culture and structure that you're working within. So it looks, I think, differently depending on where you are. I think part of it is, though, having the courage to bring up these conversations when you have the opportunity, whether it is in a staff meeting or just in those conversations you have in the hallway, that you can hopefully live it and be the example, and just encourage the conversations to happen. Do you want to add anything? Yeah. It's tricky. Again, it just depends where you are and what organization you're working in, because some are much more open. We're fortunate where we are. It's part of our mission, and as our museum, to have these conversations. But for a lot of places, it's not part of their mission or anything. people aren't even thinking about it or recognizing that it's an issue. So.
Yeah, I can jump in too and add that it is part of these formal and informal conversations that you just mentioned, Anne. I know that we here at the Art Institute, I have some colleagues that realized that they were sitting on one-on-one lunches with one another and talking about articles that they were reading and enjoying and things that were moving them and shaping their practice. And it slowly started more and more people wanting to join them and curious what they were doing when they were sitting in that classroom eating lunch together. And so it started with became a brown bag lunch session that then extended not just in education, because it turned out someone talked to someone else and they were like, hey, our department's having that same conversation as well in small groups. And so recognizing that these aren't happening in little vacuums and that it truly does take these open dialogues in these spaces to bring those pieces together, because everybody's perspective is coming from a different avenue. And I think that links really well to one final question I wanted to pose over to Monica really quickly. That how, as a field, and we can even extend it beyond museum education to think about museums broadly, how are we getting out of the way or making space to create opportunities for demographic diversity in museums in general? So thinking about our employment and what are some things that you're seeing being done really well, and what can we do better? So I'm gonna give you that giant question and then ask you to answer it really quickly too, because we're coming short on time, which is another reminder that this is one of many conversations to come, but an important point I'd love to hear your input on.
Sure. So the collective that we started with Museum Q was really organized around this question. We are a collective of people of color. A lot of us are socially conscious working in museums or educators. They came together to hold space for ourselves and our peers in the sector, make our presence felt in museum spaces and be unapologetic and counter these false narratives that we're hard to find. So we really think museums should reflect the breadth and depth of the U.S. population and that people of color are more than qualified to lead. And as such, we really do a lot to pipeline people of color into careers and into leadership positions. So last year we placed 12 people in jobs in the museum sector. This year we're hoping to do more. We have a private Facebook jobs group that has 800 people that are actively job seeking, sharing resources, sharing jobs they know of. So we're really creating our own economy. We're not waiting to be discovered. We're not waiting to come in vogue. We're not waiting for a savior. And we're really doing it for ourselves and saying, you know what, we're going to be our sister and our brother's keeper and self-reliant and generative around solutions. Also to that end, we have a tweet chat coming up next Tuesday with Create Equity, which does a lot of dynamic work as an arts blog and an action think tank. And the question is, how do we increase diversity in staffing to create a healthier arts ecosystem? So I invite everyone on this tweet chat or this Google Hangout to tune in next Tuesday, February 16th from 6 to 7 Eastern Standard around that question, and follow at Museum Hugh and hashtag Hugh's Day.
Wonderful. Thank you, thank you. I think it's another great reminder, you know, to the point we were just making. These conversations are happening in so many places, and that whether you are coming to the conversation wearing a professional hat or a personal hat of this desire to learn about, to advocate for, to work for change, and for access, and to work for audiences and for learning of many different varieties, then to search for and to be a part of these different groups and these different conversations, and to utilize the resources that are shared here, but then to look to your peers, not just in education, to museums, to our community groups, to those that are really working and thinking about these topics every day. And so know that you're not alone in working through it. You're not alone in struggling through it, that there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of ambiguity, and that they're really important questions to work through. So shockingly, we are at 3 minutes to the end of our conversation. I think it's been said a couple times so far today, but another reminder that this was, you know, certainly not going to solve or address every issue under the broad title of diversity in this hour. This is one of many conversations to come, and we're super grateful in the interest. I know that there's a few more questions that are held here. I'd love to be able to hold them and to bring them back into another conversation and hear other voices, invite other individuals to the table to really continue and to make this as strong as it can be. But thank you to everyone who's watching. I want to give a super huge thank you to Anna and Candra and Margaret and Monica and Naomi. there's been a lot of food for thought, and there's so much more to share. It's not easy, but it's important. Check out that Google Plus page to see and add to resources. We'll have our next peer-to-peer hangout on Wednesday, March 9th. It's at the same time, 12 Central Time. And that hangout is going to be responding to university art museums. And you can check out the NAEA Museum Education Google Plus page to learn more about that, to check out the resources, to see what other events and conversations are coming up. And I want to thank everyone who participated today. And unless there's any final words, any last thoughts in our last seconds and moments together? All right. All right, well, that's been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. So many things to start. We're looking at people's questions, some of the groups and some of the resources that were mentioned in today's comments from our panelists. We'll go through and we'll add them into the resources, Monica in particular, those hashtags and URLs that you just shared for your events. Looks like folks are excited to continue in the conversation. So thank you all. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you soon.